What's it like gaming at 4K when your budget is just $100 for your graphics card? If that's you, or you're just here out of sheer curiosity, I've tested this GTX 1080 at 4K mainly because I was kind of curious. You might be sitting there thinking, why on earth are you testing a GTX 1080 at 4K? And if I'm being brutally honest with you, I kind of ran out of video ideas for this week. But in all fairness, when the GTX 1080 launched, people were saying it was a 4K capable graphics card. Yes, obviously in 2024, 8 years on after its launch, it's not really going to be that good at 4K. But if you're looking for a sensible 4K gaming graphics card, I'll have some links in the description below with my Amazon affiliate links. I do make a small kickback from these and it does really help out the channel. So if you're looking for a new graphics card, use them if you don't mind. But back to this Pascal flagship, how does it game at 4K 8 years past its launch? And to find out, I've tested it at, well, 4K with a sprinkle of some balanced FSR as well to give it a helping hand, which it will need today. All testing has been done in my Ryzen 5 7600 testing PC, which has 16 gigabytes, 32 gigabytes of 6200 MHz CL32 DDR5 memory, a 2TB Western Digital SN770 Gen 4 NVMe SSD, and an MSI X670E Tomahawk motherboard. I've left the 1080 at its stock out of the box settings, and I've used the latest NVIDIA Game Ready driver at the time of testing. I can't remember it, you probably can't remember it, so it's going to be listed down there. With that being said, let's see how this gets on at 4K. Starting off and taking it easy with the GTX 1080, I'm using Fortnite for the first game, and to be fair, a competitive gaming experience is easily doable on the Performance API because 269 FPS on average with a somewhat not that great 1% low, but it is Fortnite after all, means if you've got a 240Hz OLED 4K, the 1080 is like totally fine for a competitive experience here. Where you will start to struggle is Cyberpunk 2077 though, because at 4K native, yeah, it's kind of rough with just 20 FPS on average. FSR Unbalanced, however, does up the frame rate by almost double, in fact, to 38 FPS, and the 1% low is looking much better there. So if you wanted I don't know, if you were cool with sort of like a 30 FPS experience, Cyberpunk is playable at 4K and a 1080 with FSR. But it's definitely far from ideal. Spider-Man is up next, and if you wanted 60 FPS on average, you're going to be disappointed because 47 for native 4K and 48 FPS for FSR balanced. For some reason, we didn't see that much of a performance leap with FSR. I did try restarting the game and the FPS still stayed the same. Not sure as to what's going on there. But for both native and 4K, the 1080 can't really cut it in Spider-Man Remastered. God of War, on the other hand, is pretty decent. 39 FPS at 4K native is, yeah, it's okay, it's not that bad. But where you do start to see some decent performance gains is with FSR. Here the 1080 got 60 FPS on average, which is very impressive in my opinion, and that 1% low stayed relatively close to it at 51 FPS. So, dare I say, it's quite a decent experience on the 1080 at 4K with FSR balanced. I might just say that. But yeah, this kind of ends with Jedi Survivor. As we know, this is probably one of the worst PC ports of all time, maybe GTA 4 levels of bad, but at native 4K, the GTX 1080 is not having a fun time here. Struggling to even get 20 FPS, which it didn't struggle because it didn't get 20 FPS. But when you enable FSR Unbalanced, it does go up to 39 frames per second for the average frame rate, and the 1% low wasn't too bad here. Is this playable? Yeah. Is it ideal? Far from it, in fact. It's pretty rough. Going back to the esports games with Counter-Strike 2, and this very CPU demanding game did very well on the GTX 1080. You're good enough for a sort of 165Hz experience, I'd like to say, with 187 FPS on average, and the 1% lows were looking relatively good for Counter-Strike 2's standards. And because of this, I felt like enabling FSR wasn't really necessary, but just know if you've got a relatively decent CPU, you can get some more performance there as well. On older GPUs, I've learned that DirectX 11 is the best API for The Witcher 3, and that's what I did here today, but you're not going to be getting 60 FPS at 4K on the medium preset with the GTX 1080, as it was only good enough for 48 frames per second. That 1% low is looking nice at 44 though, so it's a relatively smooth frame rate. The downside to enabling DirectX 11 in The Witcher 3 though is you don't get access to FSR, which is kind of a big downside, because that would have easily allowed us to get over 60 FPS on average, so that is a bit of a wounder. Well, I'd be lying if I said the performance wasn't rough, particularly at native 4K, but I want to start off on some of the good points, and that is with the esports games. Who would have thought esports titles would have been the best to run? But despite that, you're good enough for a sort of a 144Hz gaming experience, I'd like to say, particularly in titles like Counter-Strike, Rainbow Six Siege, and obviously Fortnite. With Fortnite being good enough for like a 240Hz OLED 4K monitor, because the performance API when you're in a pinch and you need some performance is absolutely clutch in Fortnite. And to be honest, with all of the esports games, they would be perfectly fine for me, but if you're more sensitive and you're probably more used to a sort of a 240Hz experience, obviously 4K on this graphics card isn't going to be good enough. But 1440p and 1080p, however, you're set in these games. But that's where playable kind of ends on this graphics card, because the AAA games were kind of rough, particularly at native. Cyberpunk and Jedi Survivor definitely struggled quite a bit at native, not even getting 30 FPS. But when you enabled FSR on balanced, yeah, the performance wasn't exactly the most ideal, but it was definitely playable, kind of, depending on who you ask, because most gamers these days, I suspect you're going to be aiming for around at least 60 FPS even in AAA titles, and this is something the GTX 1080 can't do at 4K, even with FSR. But God of War managed to get 60 FPS with FSR enabled, so that's got to count for something, right? So, I can confidently say that 4K is definitely off of the cards for this 8-year-old Pascal flagship. Pascal flagship. Yes, it wasn't going to be a great gaming experience to begin with. I knew this getting into the video, and you probably knew that as well. But for $100, to say that 4K is kind of playable on a graphics card like this is kind of amazing in my opinion. And I think it goes to show that AMD with FSR is really clutch for older graphics cards like this, not just at 4K, even at lower resolutions like 1440p and maybe 1080p if you really need to get some performance on an older graphics card. Conversely, if you want a much more sensible graphics card for 4K gaming, I've got some links in the description. Yeah, these will cost a bit more, but 4K is a bit of a more premium resolution, I'd like to say, so you're going to have to fork out a bit more money for that. But back to the GTX 1080, I'd say keep it to Full HD or Quad HD, and you're going to be having a much better gaming experience on this GPU, particularly with 1080p. So if you want to see how this GPU gets on at both of those resolutions, there's a video up there for it. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next one.